about King Rat by James Clavell. This is a work of historical fiction that, although it has its flaws, I think is a pretty thematically strong book that I do recommend and want to talk about in this video today. So King Rat is the fourth book in the Asian saga, which began with Shogun. Second book was Taipan. Third book was Gaijin, and King Rat is the fourth book. The Asian saga is laid out in chronological world order, but this was his first book. So this is Clavell's debut as an author. Apparently he was writing for Hollywood and there was a writer's strike and he didn't have anything to do, and his wife said, "Why don't you tell your story that you've been wanting to tell?" And that story was King Rat. So my individual book reviews, I try to isolate the different components of the storytelling: plot, character, setting, theme. I usually lay them out in that order, but this one, it makes sense to go kind of a different order. I'm going to start with the setting and then talk about the characters, the plot, and then finish up with the themes in this book. But the setting is a POW camp, and this book is semi-autobiographical because Clavell was in a Japanese POW camp during World War II, and that is the setting. I didn't do enough research to find out if he is choosing the exact same camp for the setting of this novel that he was in, but I suspect that it was. This is a camp that's in Malaysia, kind of the tip of Malaysia, right by Singapore. And it's a huge, sprawling facility. This is not, I had trouble picturing it at first, but it is not just a kind of localized small camp. There are thousands, tens of thousands, maybe even hundreds of thousands of prisoners in this big, sprawling prison camp. And there are various areas of this, and the setting was brought to life very well. There are parts where most of the prisoners are kind of almost living in barracks rather than living in cells in the prison portion. And there is a prison portion for kind of the inmates that need to be in those portions of the prison. But the POW camp, I thought the setting was brought to life very, very well. Very early on, I think that Clavell established the setting extremely well. Additionally, the other side of the setting is just simply the prisoners. And I think he did a pretty good job early on, and then an impeccable job at the end of the book, just showing you the state of these prisoners' lives, just the emaciated figures that they become, the dirty, disgusting, destitute people that they become. They're wearing, kind of sarongs, and they barely have clothes. They don't have toilet paper, so they're fighting dysentery and they have to use the bathroom, and it's really disgusting. And Clavell leaned into those very well. And I think especially by the end of the book, you really see and you really feel just the horrific conditions of this POW camp. So this book, King Rat, has an interesting title, and one of the main characters is called the King, and he's an American prisoner of war, and he's called the King. We don't really get another name for him, but we find that he is basically the king of this entire POW camp because he has, just through his cunning and scheming, kind of has a stranglehold on the black market in this prison camp. So he's the person that has all the schemes of getting goods in and out of the camp, trade, stealing food, stealing electronics, getting radios so they can get contact to the outside world. And he kind of has a stranglehold on this. And you see early on that this sets him apart in many ways. And you see early on that when we kind of embrace, I mentioned what the prisoners look like when they're in this just very kind of destitute, barely have any clothing that's clean. The king is still doing well enough that he's wearing a uniform. And he's set apart, but he has a lot of people doing his will because he'll give them food, he'll give them a lot of the things that the creature comforts that they wouldn't get any other way than if they were with the king, who has kind of just been ruling this black market that's going on. When the schemes with the king were at its best, it reminded me of Catch-22, that novel, which was excellent. And there were a lot of kind of shades of that in this book. Two other characters I want to mention before I talk about just the plotting and pacing of this book. There's another character named Philip Marlowe, which in many ways I feel is Clavell's stand-in in this book. Clavell's an Englishman and Marlowe's an Englishman, and Marlowe becomes kind of the unlikeliest of friends to the king because they're polar opposites. In many ways, Marlowe sees what the king's doing and thinks he's exploitative towards his fellow prisoners. There are some, not to talk about theme yet, but kind of some subtle discussions about capitalism versus socialism in this prison society that they found themselves. And Marlowe is kind of the only person that King can trust because of some acts that happen early in the book. And he's a very interesting character, and I thought he was kind of, if I had to pick the main character of the book, it's Marlowe. Because this is a very diverse cast of characters. It's third-person point of view, and it jumps around a lot. There are a lot of point of views in this book, and I think it enriches the story because it shows you kind of the bigger picture of what's going on, and we're not just zoomed into one or two characters. There is a third character I want to mention that is more of a side character, but I think has a very important thematic purpose in the book. There's a character, Sergeant Gray, and he's almost the villain of the book. I wasn't sure if this was something that was true until I did some reading after finishing this book, but apparently these POW camps were so big that the Japanese didn't have enough guards to staff the entire prison. So they would often enlist the help of the officers of the prisoners of war, as well as the military police. And this Sergeant Gray is a military policeman. In many ways, he's kind of the villain of the story because it seems his whole purpose in this book is to try to catch the king so you can take him from kind of the barracks area and put him in the true prison portion. And he is just kind of obsessed with catching the king. And the portrayal along the book is that he's a traitor. I mean, he's an Englishman and he's working for the Japanese. But he does serve a very important purpose in this book, especially thematically, which I'll talk about after I talk about plot here. So the plotting and pacing for me is probably the weakest portion of this book. The plotting was very slow at times and very repetitious, and it actually felt kind of pointless at times. It wasn't pointless, and when I talk about theme, I'll say why, but as an example, there are large tracks in the middle of this book where we're getting, here's the scheme that the king is planning, and then he's almost going to get caught by Gray, and then he doesn't, and then, oh, here's the next scheme that they're going to do. And it just kind of felt kind of dull and kind of repetitious, and it was very slow at this point in the book. And it was pretty early in the book where kind of this started along. And I felt that was the biggest thing why I didn't feel this is a masterpiece. This isn't up to the level of Shogun or Taipan, but I still think it's a very good book. I felt that it just kind of meandered in the middle quite a bit. And one of the things that reinforced that to me was there were times where Clavell would break away from the POW camp and he would give you these stories of kind of the loved ones, the wives, the family members of these POWs elsewhere, obviously not in the camp. And I found I was enjoying those asides a lot more than what was going on in the prison camp, just because it just felt like it was, I used the word frippery in my GOODREADS review, but I just felt that it was just not as intriguing and just didn't seem to have the importance of taking up so much time in this book. Well, this is a non-spoiler review, so I'll say that we know that the war ends. What we don't know leading in this book is this going to be an ending where the prison camp is liberated, or is this one of those camps where the Japanese kill everybody to save face? So you'll find that out along the way, but when we do get to the end, that's when Clavell really shined in this book, and that's when he really just brought home thematically what he was trying to say in King Rat. So the biggest theme in this book is one of survival. And when you start to just recognize that, for me it was in the book when things started wrapping up and you really started to reflect upon what had happened. And you realize in the instance of the king and all of his people around him trying to do all these little schemes, that was their way of surviving. It was giving them a purpose, giving them a reason to live, was to try to outsmart their Japanese enslavers by sneaking in a radio or stealing this item from somewhere else. So for them, it was in many ways just a defense mechanism so that they wouldn't lose their wits, they wouldn't lose their will to live. Additionally, when I shine that theme onto the character of Sergeant Gray that I brought up, it really shows that probably him being this villain, although he probably is still kind of a villain, I think it really just showed that he was probably doing this just as a survival mechanism for himself as well. by being able to still kind of do his job in this prison camp as a military policeman. It gave him a sense of purpose and helped him live on. So you kind of understand the character, even if you can still see him as kind of the primary villain of the entire book. So the one theme that really wasn't there, which I was disappointed, was the overarching theme of the rest of this Asian saga. This is a series called the Asian Saga. The expectation that I have as a reader is that we're going to continue to get what we got in the first 3 books, and that's a discussion of Western culture versus Eastern culture, and how they mix together, how they learn from each other, how they're different, and how neither of them is better than the other. And I loved just the cross-cultural exploration in the first 3 books. I think it's something that Clavell just excels at. And he excels at it here in a very subtle manner. And it's not West versus East, because there are very few passages. We really don't get a lot of characters, Thai, Malay, or Japanese in this story. But what we do get is we get a lot of American and English. And he does a good job of kind of delineating the difference between those 2 cultures. And even amongst the Englishmen, you see kind of a divide between kind of the noble class, which are the officers, and then kind of the commons class, of which Sergeant Grey is one. So there's a further conflict between him and Marlowe because of the class system in England. So he does that very well, but that was something that, for me, having read the previous 3 books in this series, brought the overall story down a bit, because it just didn't have that depth of that theme, which I've enjoyed so much because Clavell's so good at it. But it is still a thematically dense book, especially the survival theme is in there. And the last 50 pages of this book are just incredible. You start to realize so much about what you've read. And I can't even allude to some of it without spoilers, but it really shines a light upon everything. And for me, it's the thing that made me continue to think about this book and maybe even reevaluate my initial reception of this book that I finished a couple weeks ago. So overall, I really enjoyed King Rat. I think if I were to rank my 4 Asian Saga books, it would be Shogun, Taipan, King Rat, Gaijin. It doesn't really belong in the Asian Saga, at least in those 4 books, although I've been told that some of the characters here may appear in Noble House, which is the next book. So I guess I'll find out when I read that book. But overall, I think this is a very fine book. I do recommend King Rat. And if you like the things that I talked about and find it interesting, I think it may be a book for you. If you like this video, please like and subscribe. You can also find me on Twitter, Goodreads, and the Fireside Discord. I'd love to interact with you there. As always, thank you for watching. Until next time, goodbye.